I am going to be discussing today my new book, The Corona Crash, which comes out on the 27th of October. And it really builds on the themes of my previous book, Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialization, which I presented not so long ago, it must have been about 6 months ago at How the Light Gets In earlier this year. But that book really looked at the kind of pre-existing problems that our economy was facing even before the pandemic hit. So Stolen was really the story of the rise and fall of finance-led growth, which I describe as this particular kind of political economic regime that governed our economy, that governed the UK's economy, the US's economy, broadly speaking, the global economy to a greater or lesser extent in different places, really kind of from the 1980s onwards. And it was characterized by what a lot of people refer to as kind of neoliberal ideology when it comes to governance. So deregulation, cutting taxes, financial deregulation in particular, privatization, and a kind of general retreat of the state from providing a lot of the kind of services that we previously relied upon the state to provide. That growth model, I argue in Stolen, was premised upon a couple of different elements that made it pretty unstable. So financialization, which was the kind of process at the core of finance-led growth, drove a lot of different changes in the way our economy works. And in the book, I look at how the firm, the household, and the state all became financialized. And I also talk a little bit about how the global economy became more financialized. And really what that means is that kind of financial institutions, so banks, hedge funds, pension funds, etc., and financial kind of motives and operations more generally, so that's really the kind of logic of lending and investment, become much more prominent in basically all areas of the economy. So you had the financialization of the corporation, which was associated with the kind of dominance of the ideology of shareholder value, which basically meant that corporations came to focus pretty much solely on their share prices, rather than, what we might have previously thought of as a kind of stakeholder model of corporate governance, or even, rather than actually doing what many of these corporations were built to do, which was kind of make things and provide services. There was a kind of singular focus on this idea of maximizing shareholder value. And the ways in which that was pursued, so particularly excessive dividends payments, massive increase in kind of mergers and acquisitions activity, share buybacks, for example, as well as the kind of general reorganization of power that took place within the firm. So workers' wages were lowered relative to the wages and perks that were gained by senior executives. And obviously the ratio of pay between the average worker and CEOs increases substantially over that period. And that really created a lot of the problems that we see with corporations today. So there are those kind of problems of governance, the fact that stakeholders, the fact that workers, the environment aren't really big factors in a lot of corporations' decision making, but also some more kind of structural economic factors. So the fact that we've seen a kind of long-term decline in investment in fixed capital amongst corporations. So, a corporation was less likely to, say, build a new factory, which would have created jobs, or, invest in research and development, than it would be to kind of basically play around with its share price. So that has created all sorts of problems around productivity. And at the same time, obviously, we had this internal redistribution of power, which led to a fall in wage growth and has led to, and this has happened across the kind of rich world, a fall in the wage share of national income and a rise in the profit share of national income. And that brings us on to how it affected the household. So you had a massive rise in borrowing. And a lot of that was mortgage borrowing, because obviously at the same time as these changes were coming in, you had a big housing boom, you had the deregulation of commercial banking, which made it much easier for people to get mortgages and to get debt more generally. And you obviously also had right to buy. So a lot of people were kind of buying, using this newly created credit to buy housing. And that, as we know, and as I explain in the book, drives this bubble that we see in the housing market in the UK and then eventually the US. Which ultimately obviously brings the whole system crashing down. And then you had the financialization of the state, which was associated with the kind of incursion of private financial institutions into the operation of the management of public services, the provision of infrastructure. You can see this with the private financing initiatives, but also with outsourcing more generally, which is, of course, very much coming back to bite during this pandemic, when outsourcing companies are basically being charged with running the government's coronavirus response and not doing so very successfully at all. So, yeah, and it's also associated with actually the rise of this idea of asset-based welfare, which is that rather than kind of socializing risk throughout society, risk is increasingly individualized. So people are encouraged to have private pensions, to store up savings in their home, and that's really what's going to protect you from any negative shocks in your life rather than the state itself. So these are all factors that are associated with financialization, and kind of as I argue in the book and as I write at the beginning of this book, those processes severely weakened both the UK economy and the global economy in the run-up to the pandemic. Obviously, we have the financial crisis, which kind of brings the energy, the dynamism that exists within that model to a halt. A lot of the productivity gains that we saw pre-financial crisis were driven by kind of financial innovation, which is just a euphemism for finding ever more ingenious ways to extract money from, ultimately it was mortgage holders, but also various other areas of the economy. So that obviously, came crashing down. But you also had these secular problems within corporations, where we had an underlying trend away from kind of investment in making things and kind of providing services that were innovative and investing in research and development and those sorts of things, and towards much more speculative activities, at least amongst many corporations in the global north, as well as because of these trends towards, obviously increasing shareholder value. The best way to do that really is to kind of corner a particular market and gain a monopoly position. So that was another way that firms had done that, and we saw a steady increase in monopoly power over that period. And ultimately, those are the trends that ultimately gave rise to that period that we've had since the financial crisis, which was characterized above all by massive stagnation. So there were those kind of underlying trends that were making the economy less dynamic, but also, there was this huge buildup of debt before the financial crisis. And then after the financial crisis, that debt had to be repaid. And that was basically, the growth we had before the financial crisis was at the expense of future growth, because that's really what debt is. If you're not using debt for investment, then you are simply kind of taking your future earnings or your future income and having it now. And that's really another big reason why we saw a lack of dynamism in the economy since 2008. Because obviously we've had a decade of wage stagnation, a decade of productivity stagnation, poverty and inequality increasing in some areas of the economy, inequality absolutely increasing. We now know that we've been systematically understating the extent of inequality in the economy because of the capacity of many individuals to hide income as wealth, basically income from work as income from other sources, or to hide income as actual physical wealth, which has prevented us from accurately understanding the scale of inequality in this country. But some researchers have actually just done some research that shows that it has grown quite substantially. So we had low productivity, low levels of investment, big current account deficit, because we have basically been relying on financial flows into our financial sector, into the City of London, really predominantly, rather than creating exports or innovating in a way that would have allowed us to compete internationally. And obviously that's all kind of overlain with this long, deep secular crisis of climate breakdown. And that was the kind of economy that we had in the period just before the financial crisis. So it was one that wasn't particularly productive, that was highly unequal, and in which a lot of both individuals and corporations were massively overburdened by debt. And this is an interesting theme that we'll pick up on later, this theme of corporate debt, because if the 2008 financial crisis was largely a crisis of kind of personal debt, of mortgage debt, and the way in which that was kind of transformed into this very valuable asset by the financial system, then a big part of the crisis we're facing now has to do with corporate debt, and has to do with the debt of kind of ordinary corporations, because obviously, at least partly because of the low interest rate environment, the combination of very low interest rates, but also not a very dynamic economy. So businesses could borrow money very, very cheaply, but they didn't really have much of an incentive to invest it productively, because there would be no guarantee that there would be demand for those products down the line. So this kind of exacerbated that problem of stagnation, because you're borrowing lots of money, but often you're not using it for investment. You're simply borrowing money because it's very cheap, and maybe you can use that to buy property or to buy back your own shares. And indeed, we saw from the big tech companies, especially them, because they're so able to borrow money so cheaply, they were actually borrowing money from banks, from investors, and using that to buy up higher yielding bonds in other companies. So they were effectively acting like banks, using their capacity to borrow very, very cheaply to gain control of other areas of the economy. And that's the interesting thing about debt, is that it really is a power relation. So, for the average person, debt is a kind of, it's a chain around your leg. Whereas for a really big, powerful corporation or for a big investor, debt is what allows you to actually expand your ownership and therefore your power over the rest of the economy.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.